Hi everyone, today I'm going to be discussing the cardiovascular system. A little overview of what I'll be mentioning is the structure of the heart, the blood vessels, the cardiac conduction and blood flow around the heart. The heart can seem a little complex to begin with, but once you've grouped these labels into categories, it's going to be a whole lot easier to understand. So our heart contains 4 different chambers. We have the right atrium, the left atrium, the right ventricle and the left ventricle. As you can see, the atrias are much smaller in respect to the ventricles, and that's because the atrias have to pump the blood to the ventricles, which is a short distance and doesn't require much muscle to do so. The right ventricle has to pump the blood towards the lungs, and the left one has to pump the blood throughout the whole body, which is why the cardiac muscle is much thicker compared to the other 3 chambers. But how does the blood enter and leave the chambers in the first place? This is the work of the blood vessels. Here we can see a combination of arteries and veins. The veins here are the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. And although it's not labelled in this diagram, these blood vessels here are known as the pulmonary veins. The arteries in this diagram are the aorta and the pulmonary trunk, which can also be called the pulmonary arteries. We are going to look at the blood vessels in a little more depth later on, but first we're going to be talking about the valves. The valves are strings which are attached to the heart walls and are in place to ensure that the blood flows smoothly and freely in one direction. Here I've drawn a diagram to help represent that. The black lines over here represent the valves and the red blob represents the blood. I've labelled them high blood pressure and low blood pressure, and the arrows indicate how the valves will open. I guess you can compare this to a door. When you push a door, it's going to move outwards and not towards you. The same way the blood pushes against the valves and causes it to open. But once the blood flows through, the valves will shut immediately and not let any of that blood back through. Our heart contains 4 main valves. We have the bicuspid valve and the tricuspid valve. These control the blood flow from the atria to the ventricles. If I go back to my heart diagram, we can see these labelled as the tricuspid and the bicuspid valve, and this can also be called the mitral valve as well. We also have the aortic valve and the pulmonary valves, and these control the blood flow out of the ventricles. So if I go back onto my diagram, we can see that in the blue tube here, we have the pulmonary semilunar valve, and then in the red tube, which is a bit harder to see, we've got the aortic semilunar valve. The heart is a very delicate organ, which is why it needs to be protected, and that job falls onto the pericardium. The pericardium is a double-walled sac which encloses the heart. It can be split into 2 sections, which I'll draw a line through, as the external wall and the internal wall. The external wall is made up of the fibrous pericardium, which is the strong, dense outer part of the pericardium. This blends with the central tendon of the diaphragm. Then we have the serous pericardium, which can be split into 3 different layers. We have the parietal layer, which lines the inner surface of the fibrous pericardium. Then we have the pericardial cavity, which is the space between the parietal and the visceral layer. And this contains serous fluid, which prevents friction when the heart is pumping. The last layer of the serous pericardium is the visceral layer, and this is closely adherent to the outer surface of the heart. The internal layer of the pericardium is made up of the myocardium, which is the muscle layer, and this is the thickest of all the 3 layers. We then have the endocardium, which is the smooth epithelial lines inside of the heart. This covers the surface of the heart and continues on as the epithelium in the blood vessels. I mentioned earlier that I was going to go into a little bit more depth with the blood vessels. So here is a diagram which includes the arteries, veins and capillaries. The general rule to remember is that the arteries flow blood away from the heart and the veins towards the heart. An easy way to remember this is that the artery begins with an A and so does a way. I've drawn a cross-section of the arteries and veins. The artery is in red and the vein is in blue. You can see that the lumen of the artery is much smaller and narrow, and the wall is thicker than the vein. And that's because the artery needs to be able to withstand high blood pressure. The vein, on the other hand, has a much larger lumen, but a smaller wall, and that's because the blood doesn't travel at such high pressure. I've also drawn some valves in the vein, and that's to stop the blood flowing in the wrong direction. The capillaries act as transfer stations between the arteries and veins. They also pick up any metabolic waste and exchange gases. Blood vessels are a major component of the heart, and that's why damaging a major blood vessel can be life-threatening. Here I've compiled a few notes of the blood vessels, some of which I've already touched on, but you can pause the video if you need and jot down some notes. In this slide, I will be demonstrating the blood flow around the heart. I'm actually going to draw out the lungs to help you understand what goes on outside. The first step is the blood flowing through the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava into the right atrium. Remember, these are the veins, so they flow blood towards the heart. The blood then flows through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. The third step involves the blood going through the pulmonary valve out of the pulmonary artery into the lungs, and this is where the blood becomes oxygenated. And now that the blood is oxygenated, it goes back into the heart through the pulmonary vein into the left atrium. And now you'll actually start to sense a pattern where the blood moves through the bicuspid valve into the left ventricle. The last stage is where the blood is actually leaving the heart. From the left ventricle, the blood moves through the aortic valve and out of the aorta into the rest of the body. And that's the flow of the heart. If you go over this cycle a few more times, you'll be sure to remember it. Now we can go on to looking at the diastole and the systole of the human heart. Systolic pressure occurs when the heart is contracting. The atrioventricular valves close and the semilunar valves open. This is when the blood flows from the heart to the lungs. You can experience systolic failure if the walls of the muscles are too thin. Diastolic pressure is when the heart is relaxed and filled with blood. The atrioventricular valves are open and the semilunar valves are closed. This causes the blood to enter the heart from the lungs. During systole, peak pressure is achieved in the arteries, and during diastole, the lowest pressure is achieved at resting phase. Blood pressure can be defined as pressure of the fluid against the wall of the blood vessel. During vasoconstriction, the blood vessel will contract and cause the lumen to decrease in size and therefore increase the blood pressure. During vasodilation, the blood vessel will relax and this will expand the lumen and therefore decrease the blood pressure. And the name given to this pressure is called hydrostatic pressure. The final part of the cardiovascular system I will be discussing is the ECG. So here I've got my heart structure again, and I've actually drawn in 3 dots, and these dots represent nodes. And nodes send electrical impulses throughout the heart to create a heartbeat. So at the top of the atrium, I have my sinoatrial node. This sends electrical impulses throughout both atriums, which stimulates a contraction. The impulse is then passed on to the atrioventricular node, which is located near the top of the ventricle. The atrioventricular node delays the electrical impulse to the ventricle. This delay is important to ensure that all the blood from the atrium has been moved into the ventricle before it contracts. The impulse then passes on to the third dot that I've drawn, which represents the atrioventricular bundle. This is located near the top of the septum. It allows the impulse to split along the apex and up the ventricle. The impulse is passed along the Purkinje fibers found in the ventricle walls, which then cause the heartbeat. The heart rate can be measured by an ECG, which is best defined as a recording of all the action potentials created by the sinoatrial node and the atrioventricular node in the heart. ECG diagrams contain waves which correspond to a letter. Here you can see the P, Q, R, S and T waves. The P wave shows when the atrium is full of blood. The sinoatrial node fires electrical impulses and causes the atrium to depolarize. The Q wave corresponds to the depolarization of the atrioventricular septum. The R wave corresponds to the depolarization of the ventricles, and the S wave is the depolarization of the apex of the heart and also atrial repolarization. Lastly, we have the T wave, which represents the ventricular repolarization. This video was made by Tamana Aziz, Marlon Anthony, Shamima Adam and Richard Amoa from the University of Greenwich. I hope you found this helpful and thank you for watching.